friends, today I'll be talking about post-colonialism, and the title of my lecture reads Post-Colonial Criticism and Literature, an Overview. The learning objectives of this lecture would be 1. The historical and intellectual context of post-colonialism. 2. The theoretical assumptions of post-colonial criticism with special reference to Frantz Fanon and Edward Said. 3. The thematic of post-colonial literature, and the last, the problematic of post-colonialism. I begin with my first learning objective, which is to understand the historical and intellectual context of post-colonialism. The term post-colonialism is used to refer to the political, linguistic and cultural experience and reaction of the former European colonies from the moment of their colonization up to and including the neocolonialism of the present day. This comprehensive use of the term is substantiated by Ashcroft, Griffiths and Tiffin in the following words, and I quote, "The term post-colonial is used to cover all the culture affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to the present day," unquote. Post-colonial criticism emerged both during and after the struggles of many nations in the tricontinent for independence from colonial rule. The tricontinent includes Africa, Asia and Latin America. According to Robert Young, the founding moment of post-colonial theory was the journal The Tricontinental, launched by the Havana Tricontinental of 1966, which initiated the first global alliance of the peoples of the three continents against imperialism. However, post-colonial criticism emerged as a distinct category only in the 1990s, notwithstanding the publication of seminal texts of post-colonialism like Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks 1950 and The Wretched of the Earth 1961. Edward Said's landmark work Orientalism appeared in 1978, but the term as such became popular around the time the book The Empire Writes Back came out in 1989, a book by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin. The term has since gained currency through the influence of such books as The Post-Colonial Critic 1990 by Gayatri Sipivak, Nation and Narration 1990 by Homi K. Baba, Cultural Imperialism 1993 by Edward Said, as well as important works by Abdul Jan Muhammad, Benita Perry and Kwame Anthony Appiah. Again, an important collection of relevant essays that needs to be mentioned is Race, Writing and Difference 1986, edited by Henry Louis Gates, Jr., one of the best-known American figures in this field. One important antecedent for post-colonialism was the growth of Commonwealth literature. Commonwealth literature was a term literary critics began to use from 1950s to describe literatures in English emerging from a selection of countries with a history of colonialism. It incorporated a study of writers from the predominantly European settler colonies as well as writers belonging to those countries which were in the process of gaining independence from British rule, such as those from African, Caribbean and South Asian nations. Literary critics began to distinguish a fast-growing body of literature written in English which included works by such figures as R.K. Narayan from India, George Lamming from Barbados, Catherine Mansfield from New Zealand and Chinua Achebe from Nigeria. The creation of this category was to consider through a comparative approach the common concerns and attributes these manifold literary voices might have. However, Commonwealth literature may well have been created in an attempt to bring together writings from around the world on an equal footing. Yet the assumption remained that these were addressed to a Western English-speaking readership. The Commonwealth in Commonwealth literature was never fully free from the older, more imperious connotations of the term. In other words, English literature and English criticism set the norm for the English language literature of the dependencies and former colonies that were brought under the ambit of Commonwealth literature. For example, a writer like Chinua Achebe was not primarily seen as Nigerian or even African, but as contributing to the English literary tradition and as an outpost of the great humanistic European civilization on which that tradition is based. Commonwealth literature then was really a subset of canonical English literature evaluated in terms derived from the conventional study of English that stressed the value of timelessness and universality. Not convinced with the European civilization's humanistic superiority, the African, Asian and Caribbean Commonwealth writers questioned the Western or Eurocentric perspective of Commonwealth criticism. These objections were voiced in Chinua Achebe's essay Colonialist Criticism, where it was argued that, first of all, overseas writers must be seen within the specific context of the culture they were part of and which informed their writing, and that, secondly, that culture was not necessarily inferior to but only different from the culture of the mother country. Nonetheless, for many critics of Commonwealth literature, these texts produced under the rubric of Commonwealth literature conformed to a critical status quo. They were not considered essentially radical or oppositional, nor were they seen to challenge the Western criteria of excellence used to read them. Their experimental elements, their novelty and local focus made them exciting to read and helped depict the nation with which they were concerned. But their potential differences were contained by the identification within them of universal themes that bound texts safely inside the aesthetic criteria of the West. The fundamental difference, therefore, between post-colonial criticism and Commonwealth literature is the insistence of the former that historical, geographical and cultural specifics are vital to both the writing and the reading of a text and cannot be bracketed as secondary coloring or background. I take up the second learning objective, the theoretical assumptions of post-colonial criticism with special reference to Frantz Fanon and Edward Said. In my previous lecture, I pointed out how colonialism dabbled in what has been referred to as colonizing the mind. The cultural values of the colonized peoples were deemed as lacking in value or even as being uncivilized, from which they must be rescued. This obviously means that there were two sides of colonialism. One was the militaristic side in the form of physical conquest and occupation of territories, and the other was the civilizational side in the form of the conquest and occupation of minds, selves and cultures. The civilizational side was an effective way of not only disempowering the colonized people but also subjecting them to trauma by making them look negatively upon their people, culture and themselves. In the 1950s, attempts were made to record the psychological damage suffered by colonized people as a result of internalizing this colonial discourse. Frantz Fanon, the psychologist, wrote passionately about the damage of French colonialism on millions of people in his two polemical books, Black Skin, White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon examines the psychological effects of colonialism and the trauma the individual has to go through for living in a world where he becomes an object of derision due to the color of her skin. He is forced to see himself, herself, not as a human subject but an object. Fanon writes that one could escape from this state of desperation and trauma if only one adapted and embraced the civilized qualities of the colonizers. But despite the effort put in by the colonized to don the white mask by accepting the educational values of the colonizers, they were never accepted on equal terms. He makes a pertinent remark in this context, and I quote, "The white world, the only honorable one, barred me from all participation. A man was expected to behave like a man. I was expected to behave like a black man," unquote. For Fanon, Postcolonialism was not just political and economic change, but psychological change. As such, postcolonialism makes its inroads when the identity formation for the colonized subject who is forced to internalize his self as an other is successfully challenged. Edward Said, in his landmark work, Orientalism, also looked at the divisive and inequitable relationship between the colonizer and colonized, but of course from a different perspective. He examined how knowledge formed by Western imperial powers about the colonies they dominated helped them justify their subjugation. Said pointed out that Western travelers hardly ever attempted to learn about the native people either directly or through interaction. Instead, they chronicled their observations on generally held assumptions about the Orient as a mythic place of exoticism, madness, and moral turpitude. These constructions were then presented as scientific truths that eventually helped justify colonial domination. Drawing upon the works of Fanon and Said, critics formulated the theoretical framework of post-colonial criticism. The most important assumptions that characterize this school of thought are: number one, to undermine the claims made by the damaging discourse of colonialism that European literary tradition has a timeless and universal significance. By claiming a universal signification for a work, the liberal humanists promoted the white, Eurocentric norms and practices and disregarded cultural, social, regional, and national differences in experience and outlook. This approach of the liberal humanist critics to judge all literature by a single, supposedly universal standard was outrightly rejected by post-colonial criticism. In his essay, Colonialist Criticism, 1974, Chinua Achebe attacks the idea that literary art should transcend its time and place. He argues that universal qualities that Western criticism accepts from literature are not so much universal as European in a universal disguise. Post-colonial critics reject the claims to universalism made on behalf of canonical Western literature and seek to show its limitations of outlook, especially its general inability to empathize across boundaries of cultural and ethnic difference. Another characteristic of post-colonial criticism was to question and unravel the Western historiography of the colonized. Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, argued that the first step for colonized people in finding a voice and an identity is to reclaim their own past, a past that has been devalued by the European colonizing power by projecting the pre-colonial era of the colonies as a pre-civilized limbo or even as a historical void. According to Derek Walcott, I quote, "Unreliability is embedded in Western historiography," unquote, because the history, culture, and progress of the colonies has been shown as beginning with the arrivals of the Europeans. Moving on to the next learning objective would be to understand the thematic of post-colonial literature. What writers learned from these critical assumptions, and in particular from Fanon and Said, was how empires colonize imagination and that the process of decolonization would necessarily involve not only returning power to those who were once ruled by the empire, but also a process that would help in, to use Gugi's phrase, decolonizing the mind. The nomenclature Commonwealth literature was dropped in favor of post-colonial literature to describe a new generation of writers who were regarded as politically radical and locally situated rather than universally relevant. One of the moving forces behind these new literatures in English from the former colonies was to create novels and poems that respond to and reflect their immediate cultural environment while producing new modes of representations. They were deemed to pose direct challenges to the colonial center from the colonized margins and gave voice and expressions to colonized and once colonized peoples. Thus, in post-colonial literature, we have moved from the view that the history of English literature is only a certain canon of texts, and authors to a view of literature as a site of contested meanings and cultures that captures the multicultural and multi-ethnic nature of current writing in English. Post-colonial literature, again, came to create a linguistic code English with a small e, which is different from the standard code English with a capital E. According to Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin, in The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures 1989, English was being now displaced by different linguistic communities in the post-colonial world. This trio of Australian critics stated that, I quote, crucial function of language as a medium of power demands that post-colonial writing define itself by seizing the language of the center and replacing it in a discourse fully adapted to the colonized place, unquote. Writers, they stated, were creating new Englishes through various strategies listed by Ashcroft et al. By, number one, inserting untranslatable words into their texts. 2. By glossing seemingly obscure terms. 3. By refusing to follow standard English syntax and using structures derived from other languages. And lastly, by incorporating many different creolized versions of English into their texts. Each of these strategies was demonstrated operating in a variety of post-colonial texts, and in each, the emphasis was on the writer's attempt to subvert and refashion standard English into various new forms of English. Another concern of post-colonial literature is to reclaim one's own past and erode the colonialist ideology by which that past had been devalued. Thus, the historical interrogation of colonialism is an important theme of post-colonial literature and part of the process of cultural decolonization. Writers revisit the past in order to question and analyze colonial ideology and retell aspects of the history of colonialism from a deliberately marginal view in a subversive manner. Another theme of post-colonial literature is to focus not only on the respective identities of colonized and the colonizer, but celebrate hybridity and cultural polyvalency. That is, the situation whereby individuals and groups belong simultaneously to more than one culture due to cultural hybridity between the colonizer and the colonized. I take up the last learning objective of this lecture, which is to understand the problematic of post-colonialism. R.F. Dirlik, in his essay, The Post-Colonial Aura, Third World Criticism in the Age of Global Capitalism, states that post-colonialism as a discourse begins when third world intellectuals arrive in the first world academics. The implication of Dirlik's essay is that post-colonialism is a form of contained opposition. This means that its opposition is itself a form of compromise. While post-colonialism allows a kind of academic upward mobility to the third world intellectuals with their arrival in the first world, it also entails a different kind of stereotyping whereby persons of color are expected to confine themselves to post-colonial or peripheral issues, with mainstream areas of Western culture remaining under the control of the white. Therefore, post-colonialism is a mixed bag. In terms of real gains, it does produce a presence of people of color in the first world academy, but in terms of the power of discourse, it reinforces Western hegemony. Although Salman Rushdie, Bharti Mukherjee, Michael Odadji, V.S. Naipaul have been labelled by prominent critics as interpreters and authentic voices of the third world, yet the criteria of evaluating the standards of the literary production are constructed and determined by the needs and demands of the Western culture. In fact, the benchmark for the success of a post-colonial writer still remains the acceptance in the center, and the center refuses to offer unconditional acceptance. Edward Said is of the view that Orientalism still survives. The machinery of colonization has still not disappeared. Colonial modes of representation have continued even after decolonization and are still very much a part of the contemporary world. Orientalism continues to exist in myriad forms under different names, according to Tobias Hübinette. He discusses three forms in which Orientalism has survived: Post-Orientalism, Re-Orientalism, and Popular Orientalism. Re-Orientalism in particular is a form of indigenized Orientalism whereby the Orient re-orientalizes itself and enters into the same space in which the colonial discourse was originally framed. For example, a notable feature of contemporary Indian writing in English is its heavy reliance on representation of poverty, displacement, and corruption, producing thereby what Huggan terms the post-colonial exotic. This particular discourse orientalizes India in different ways because it works on the formula of repetition, recognition, and legitimization of dark India. Writers like Arvind Adiga, Manu Joseph, Raj Kamal Jha, G. Thail, Atish Tasir, amongst others, re-orientalize India by exoticizing its ethnic identity and culture. Here, the representation is largely in the hands of the few, a select elite, mostly an English-speaking and Western-educated groups of Orientals. As a result, power is transformed from one dominant group to another and does not constitute a significant change in the paradigm of power. Again, the mission of post-colonial literature, which is to write narratives of nationalism and narratives of belonging, seems to have been dented with the cultural exchange between the colonizer and the colonized, either in the form of hybridity or diaspora. According to Fanon, I quote, "The consciousness of self is not closing of a door to communication. National consciousness, which is not nationalism, is the only thing that will give us an international dimension," unquote. Although anti-colonial nationalism mobilizes and organizes the aspirations of the oppressed and the colonized the world over, yet it paves way for the emergence of a global community. In other words, national consciousness or anti-colonial nationalism brings about a transformation of social consciousness which moves beyond the limits of nationalism to a pluralistic vision of the world. That is to say, national consciousness or anti-colonial nationalism does not restrict itself to a tired impasse between repression and retaliation. Rather, it moves beyond the reciprocal antagonism between the colonizer and the colonized. It results in post-nationalism, which is concerned with the fulfillment of two objectives. One, it shows the transformation of the colonizer and the colonized. Two, it results in an inter-civilizational alliance against institutional suffering and oppression. Paul Gilroy, in The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, 1992, speaks of a culture that is not specifically African, American, Caribbean or British, but all of them at once. He calls it a Black Atlantic culture whose themes and techniques transcend ethnicity and nationality to produce something new and until now unremarked. The intellectual and political cross-fertilization that Gilroy speaks of resulted from Black diaspora to Europe and America. This movement led to an intercultural and transnational formation which provides a means to re-examine the problems of nationality, location, identity, and historical memory. For example, many writers from the Caribbean now live in other parts of the world, be that in the old colonial centers such as France and Britain or in other parts of the Americas such as the USA and Canada. Their work, although different in many respects, is characterized by a refusal to belong to any nation or racial community and stresses the migratory, transnational character of their personal history which they see reflected in the history of the Caribbean itself. Thus, narratives of nationalism, the cornerstone of post-colonialism, become an impossibility with such global mixing of cultures and identities. Similarly, Paul Gilroy also helped redirect analysis from nation-based study towards the consideration of multiple diasporic formations, traveling culture, and travelling theories. We have Said, Baba and Sipivak assigning a privileged role to the intellectual's position as exile. Salman Rushdie believes that the act of migration is one that profoundly changes the individual, transforming the relationship of the migrant with both his or her home country and new host country and impacting his identity thereby. Rushdie's thoughts are well captured in this quote. It is the fate of migrants to be stripped of history, to stand naked amidst the scorn of strangers upon whom they see rich clothing, the brocade of continuity and the eyebrows of belonging, unquote. Narratives of belonging, like the narratives of nationalism, are not therefore much suited to the present-day world, where experience and legacy of migration have created a position of in-betweenness. The migrant realizes that systems of knowledge, views of the world are not whole or pure, but incomplete, mixed or hybrid. In the space of in-betweenness, the migrant has a feeling of not being firmly rooted in a place. It is argued that post-colonial theory has reached a dead end. Robert Fraser suggests that post-colonial theory in the old sense is dead. Stuart Hall, in his essay, When Was the Post-Colonial? Thinking at the Limit, defines the need to rethink post-colonialism in dialogue with globalization. In fact, globalization, diaspora and cosmopolitanism have each emerged as contenders for describing a new problem space that might replace the post-colonial. That having said, it is not entirely clear that post-colonialism has accomplished the work it set out to do. There has been a proliferation of texts, special issues, research resources, introduction to the field, but post-colonial theories have yet to make a difference within or beyond the academy. For example, post-colonial analysis has not succeeded in changing media representations of non-Western cultures or influencing the ways in which 9/11 and its aftermath have been understood. Colonial stereotypes of the white woman, menaced by supposedly primitive male natives, has not ended with the emergence of post-colonialism, but live on in Western media and the popular consciousness. It is therefore stated that the critical edge of post-colonialism needs to be revived and redirected, and that such a revival may come through addressing the concepts of autonomy, cosmopolitanism and diaspora together. In particular, the notion of autonomy takes the center stage in this task. Post-colonialism needs to address the question of autonomy while shuttling between the ambivalences signaled by the other two concepts that move beyond the nation toward a post-colonial domain. It needs to negotiate between local and global concerns, to be very much of its own time and place, and in an equally important sense turned towards a large world and community. This is where I end my lecture, dear friends. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again. Till then, take care.